The great thing about your dream car is that you're never wrong. And the pursuit of your dream car is one of the things that, motivates a lot of us through our careers. And so for me, as soon as I saw the Road and Track article with the fastest 100 miles, fastest 100 kilometers, and the furthest distance driven in an hour in the spring of 2002 using the first production Lamborghini Murcielago, I was hooked. I just thought it was the ultimate car. It embodied everything that I thought the ultimate supercar could be. A big naturally aspirated V12, a manual transmission, still as analog as it could be, but modern enough that you could really use the car. It was a big advancement over the Diablo. So immediately, probably even more than a McLaren F1, as something I thought I had a chance to attain, the Murcielago was my dream car. Now, of course, at that point, I didn't have the ability to buy one. I didn't even have a roadmap to how I might own one, but I knew that was the goal. Now, fast forward many years, I've owned 8 of them now, and it still remains the car I am most excited to get in and drive. Now, I've got 3 of them, a manual transmission LP640 Coupe, a manual transmission LP640 Roadster, and an E-Gear SV. Now, the first obsession was really with the manual LP640 coupes in the USA. And I started making a list, which I've talked about as being one of the reasons why we started the VinWiki app. And so that list has grown ever so slightly, but pretty quickly I was able to identify most of them, primarily because there are so few. And that's one of the things that immediately started to stand out to me while I was selling cars at Lamborghini Atlanta, was that whenever we'd go out trying to find a manual Gallardo or a manual Murci, they were a lot harder to find than it seemed like they should be. We'd always thought that when you offer somebody a manual option or a single clutch sequential manual, that about 90 to 95% of them were gonna get the paddle shift car. It turned out it was more like 99%. So there were 2 generations of the Murci. There were the 6.2 liter cars from 2002 to 2006. 07 and on uses a 6.5 liter motor, the LP640 or LP650, LP670. Now, of course, this gets super duper nerdy, but there were no good factory records. And so as I was trying to compile the list, I actually asked the people that were our reps from the factory, can you tell me how many of these cars there are? And they couldn't. No one could. I talked to people every level up, and there just wasn't a good way for them to search, even though I could tell them which system to go in, which VIN prefix to ask for, just to tell me what there were, and none of them could figure out how to do it. It wasn't like Porsche or even Ferrari, where they do have exquisitely kept factory records. And so I knew it was going to be an uphill battle, but I think on the first list that I had, it was like 18, 19, maybe 20 cars. And to this day, we only had found 23 possible US manual 640 coupe VINs and 10 for the Roadsters in the US. So I had been on an ongoing project to try to put together the list, the consummate VIN list. I've had a global Murci list growing on VinWiki since we launched the app in 2016. And so that was always the goal, is like, let's get a conclusive proof of exactly how rare each of the variants of these cars are. So when you look at a Lamborghini Murcielago VIN, it's going to generally start ZHWBU. Previously, there were ZA9 VINs. Those were more like a Diablo convention, but around VIN 700, they switched. So it'll be ZHWB, U for the US, E for Europe, C for Canada, or A for Asia and the rest of the world. And then you have the variant code, and that'll be 3 characters. For a Murcielago LP640 manual coupe, it'll be 37M. S instead of the M would be E-Gear. Then you've got a check digit. Then you've got a character for the year. It'll be 2 to an A. A is for 2010. And then you have LA0 and then a 4-digit serial number. So those will go from 0 to 4,099. We always thought there were 4,099 VINs because that's the logical conclusion of the VIN range. That's what Lamborghini always said that they built. And so I was out to find all 4,099 VINs. And I finally found somebody at the factory that said they thought they knew where a document was that had all of them. And I found this person through Alex Hess, the dealer in Germany that I got my red Murci SV from. So that was a US car that had been totaled here and then rebuilt in Europe, and I brought it back to the US, a reasonably easy importation process. But I'd also, through him, found some other US cars that were in Europe that we could bring back in. Doug Tabbitt bought a Diablo, Casey Putsch bought a Murci coupe, so that we've been always looking for these cars, because usually US cars in Europe don't sell all that well. So if you're ever looking for a car in Europe, or even if you're a US buyer looking for a car in Europe, contact Alex Hess. I'll put a link in the description below. So his guy comes through with a 98-page PDF of VINs. And some of them are, broken down a little bit. Some of them are duplicated. But the problem is you can't just copy and paste and move data off of a PDF into a spreadsheet, at least not when it was all askew and everything to go with it. And so what I had to do with that was send it to several different software developers who used OCR software, optical character recognition, to take each page and put it into text. So that took several weeks, and we ended up with 4 different decoded lists. Now, of course, whenever that happens, you're going to get a lot of 8s for 0s or 5s for S's and things like that. And so you have to go through with what you would expect each VIN to be, and then make sure that it makes sense and make sure that the errors are not there. That works until you start to find actual exceptions, cars where nothing actually makes sense in the way that the VIN is constructed. But ultimately, we got the list put together, and we were short by a couple hundred, which is not bad, when we're talking about over 4,000 VINs. But we weren't really sure how we were going to reconcile the differences. So we go through, we figure out which ones overlap, which ones don't, and we get the best list we have out of the first document. Then we go back to the VinWiki app, see which ones are posted, because at this point I think we have about 2,500 of the 4,099 possible VINs in the VinWiki app. Now, the effort to compile this list was a multi-year effort between the VinWiki users, myself, people at the factory, friends, everybody, but it really came down to the help from Alex Hest. We also got a lot of help from Dan Doucette. He's helped us with some of the lists for the appraisal series. He's been my co-driver on the musket ball. He's a great asset to VinWiki and a great friend, and he helped us to really comb through and kind of curate this list into something that was digestible and build the graphics that we made for people to be able to share and more easily understand what we found going through each of these VINs. So through that process and looking at other registries, we started to narrow the gaps down. And we ended up noticing that pretty much we just have the first 25 that are reserved as pre-production cars. We had most of those VINs. 26 is the first production car. That is the one that set the records at Nardo. And then we have the array of the rest of the VINs that go up to 4,099. The only 2 that we were really missing, where we kind of had all of the VINs around it and everything else made sense, was 22 and 1287. There was also a gap of 84 VINs that immediately followed the 14 RGT VINs. So Lamborghini made race car versions of the Murcielago, and then they sort of stopped. And they obviously wanted to do a one-make racing series or put more of them into more racing, but that never really happened. They were never super successful as race cars. They are some really pretty and cool looking race cars. The factory had no records of any of the cars being built, so we know that they really weren't, but they might have wanted to build more for a one-make racing series. But there was this big gap around the 2004 cars that they sort of just moved past. And there's a lot of reasons a manufacturer might do that, but the other thing that you would see is that around the transitions, things get a little bit weird. Sometimes they're building 2 model year cars back and forth simultaneously. For instance, when they brought out the LP640s, some of the cars had kind of an early VIN convention that most likely was an LP640, but you can't always be sure, and even the factory isn't all that sure. We actually found a 2004 Roadster. They didn't start until model year 2005, and it turned out that was the Batman car from Batman Begins. We have not found the manual transmission LP640 coupe in Grigio Telesto that was crashed in The Dark Knight. And if you happen to know where that crashed gray Batman manual LP640 in Europe is, I'll pay you a lot of money to help me find it. But what I'll pay you even more money to help me find is one of 2 cars that we have now discovered that exist, and they are manual Lamborghini Murcielago LP670 SVs. Now, Lamborghini said they made 350 SVs by badging them out of 350. So for instance, my car was originally 240 out of 350. Then at Copart, somebody stole all the stuff out of the interior, including that plaque. And when they reordered a new one, it was 257 for some reason, which is a black car in Miami. So I've tried to order another 241. Maybe it'll come in one day. Parts take a long time. Lamborghini said they only built 186, but that wasn't true. We were up to about 250 VINs in the app, but I've now learned that there are 308. Now, the manual cars that we knew of were 3 white cars in the US, 2 matte white and 1 gloss white, one of which has been totaled, one of which has over 30,000 miles, and then 2 in Europe, a Rosso Vic car and a matte brown car with a cream interior and gold wheels. None of these cars have really transacted since people have started to learn how rare they were. I think the last one that sold was less than 500 grand, but now they're definitely worth at least $2, maybe $3 million. Now that was with the expectation that there are 5. Now, the 2 that we have now discovered that exist, one is a US car and one is European. Now, there's no records of the US car ever coming into the US. Nothing on Carfax, nothing you can Google, no shipping manifest, anything like that. And that would be really hard to do if it actually had come in. So I believe the car is still in Europe or somewhere else in the world. The same thing for the European car. Now, these are very early. It's possible they were crash test cars, whatever, but I want one. To me, that is the unicorn, that is the holy grail. I'll pay $100,000 to any of you who can get me useful information that allows me to buy either of the cars at a reasonable price. I very, very much want to have one, and I'd like to think that they could be sold and the US car at least could be brought into the US now. The other one will be 25 years old at some point, but it is the holy grail, the unicorn for me. I will be honest, it's only for me if it's orange or has a comfort seat interior. Other than that, John Tamarian wants it and he pays just as well. So please do let us know if you've seen any information about either of these cars. We don't know what color they are, we don't know where they are, the factory doesn't know where they're at, but they do know that they were built and that they weren't necessarily like prototype cars or test cars or crash cars or anything like that. So please come to us and tell us what you know about either, and hopefully it'll be the fourth Murci in the garage. What could possibly be better? But as you go through a deep dive into automotive data like this, you find some really, really interesting things. Like for instance, number 1300. It's VIN almost like an LP640, but it's built around the time of the 2004s. My guess is it's the yellow LP640, sort of most of a car shell that hung on the wall in the museum for all the years, but we don't really know. The factory thought that was a good guess as well. So who knows exactly how this happened, but I'm so excited to be able to continue to uncover this, to put all the VINs back into VinWiki, see where else the cars have been spotted, so we can continue to know more and more about these amazing cars. Now, what was really interesting was seeing how rare so many of the variants are. For instance, there are only 1,921 first-generation cars, and only 985 of those were manual coupes. There's 69 manual first-generation roadsters. And then of the LP640s, what I'd spent most of my time focusing on, there are 88 manual coupes for the entire world and 23 for the US. So I had 22 on my list, and there was one that I had seen as a probable VIN, and it had one entry on Carfax when it was brand new, but then absolutely nothing and no signs of export, so I thought it might have just been a clerical error, but they say that it's true, so I guess it's true. And then manual LP640 Roadsters, there's only 16 cars for the whole world. 10 of them are in the US, and the worst one is in my garage. That's always what I try to achieve, but when you think about a car that there's just 16 of in the entire world, I mean, there's only 14 Hemi Cuda convertibles, and they're what, $2, $3, $4 million cars today? Obviously, these cars are all a lot more rare than we possibly imagined. When you look at all LP640 Roadsters, they're rarer than Enzos and 16Ms and a lot of vintage Ferraris and things that we know are rare or we think about as rare, but in reality, these are a whole lot more rare. So I hope that it helps the values because I've got a lot of them in my garage, but at the end of the day, I just hope that it makes it easier to understand my favorite car on Earth. And again, thank you so much to this month's sponsor, Glossit. Check them out at the link in the description below to get their best DIY ceramic coating deal ever.